Okay, so let's get into 1940, the official beginning of World War II, if you will. We'll start with sickle stroke. This was the strategy used by Hitler to go into France. Um, Textbooks should have some good maps to show how he would work this. First, he goes into Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Uh, these are all, he does this May 10th, 1940. Holland would surrender by the 15th. Germans would cross the Meuse on the 13th and would finally begin their invasion of France on the 14th. Belgium fought valiantly. The Germans admitted this, but they were blamed by the Allies for not allowing them to essentially garrison troops there to prepare for the German invasion. The Allies felt that if they could have done this, they could have blunted the invasion, possibly uh, prevented it from occurring. Belgium, though, was against this because they saw this as infringing upon their neutrality, the one thing they hoped would keep them out of the war. And how did that work? The Belgians also knew the Allies would not sacrifice all for their little country. Neutrality is an interesting question with this war. The United States, of course, claimed to be neutral. We were not. Many of the Scandinavian countries, which we commonly associate with neutrality, Norway, Sweden, they would side with the Nazis, as would Switzerland. They're often given a free pass. We may provide a video lecture on this, but their actions were quite questionable and certainly helped the Nazis. So let's get to the fall of France. Hope I'm not giving anything away. This is actually considered by many to be Hitler's greatest gamble. Now, many of us would consider the invasion of the Soviet Union for obvious reasons, but at the time, the Soviet military was considered outdated and weak, whereas the French military still had a strong reputation. The British and the United States believed that Germany would run over the Soviets with no problem, but France? German Franz Halder wrote in his diary in November 1939 regarding the planned invasion of France, quote, "None of the higher headquarters think that this offensive has any prospect of success." And he was not alone. Most of the military experts in the German military were against the attack, mainly because they believed the Germans lacked the capacity to gain victory. Why? The Allies at the time possessed more tanks than the Germans, and their tanks were better. This led to overconfidence, though, as the commander in chief of the French army promised that Hitler would, quote, definitely be beaten. And there was no use of revolutionary military tactics necessary. Hitler followed the traditional Prussian tactics dating back to Frederick the Great. Quote, the Prussian army always attacks. And this was nothing new. Hitler's plan was a variant of the Schlieffen Plan used during World War I, a sweeping attack through Belgium and the Netherlands towards France. But this original idea was somewhat ameliorated. Why change the plan? The Allies had captured a draft of the plan when a German plane crashed over Belgium in January of 1940. And because Hitler liked to go for the spectacular, remember, he was upset that he was handed Czechoslovakia. He wanted to decimate it and show the world his military's true potential. General Erich von Manstein would create a plan backed by Heinz Guderian, who was a tank commander, and General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A. The idea was that the main offensive against the West should not come through Belgium and the Low Countries, but instead further south, through the forest of the Ardennes, directly into France around the Sedan. Around Sedan, the attack through Belgium would still take place in an attempt to surprise the opposition. Many of you may be familiar with the Maginot Line created by the French. They believed that this would stop German invasion. The Germans just went around it. The Germans used this two-pronged attack in its invasion of France, fooling an overconfident France and Britain who thought they knew which way he would enter. As expected, Army Group B did move in through the north, but Army Group A surprisingly entered via the Ardennes, something the French believed was impenetrable. The panzers of Army Group A would slice through the Ardennes and race west to cut off a large part of the French army and the entire British army and then annihilate it. Thus, the Germans put forth 7 armored divisions against the large French and British armies, racing to the coast with no supporting infantry behind them. This provides an opportunity for counterattack if Britain, France, Belgium, and Holland can appropriately organize. May 10th, the German attack begins. The Allies are deceived by the true location of the Wehrmacht's main attack at French military headquarters. One officer heard the remark, quote, "See how the general was right to attach no importance to anything except the northeastern front." This overconfidence would doom the Allies in the battle, even when reports came in from the southern sector that there were German troop movements around the Ardennes. The French and British showed little urgency to react. They considered this a diversionary attack. Well, it wasn't. German armored units moved through the Ardennes and crossed the River Meuse by May 13th, within 3 days of the battle's start. The Allied plan was for defensive forces would gradually retreat to the line of the river and then hold there for reinforcements, but this now became impossible. On May 14th, Sedan fell to the Germans, and on May 15th, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud contacted Churchill. Now, at this time, Churchill had only been prime minister for a few days. Reynaud opens the discussion with the words, quote, "We have been defeated." Reynaud would call on two heroes from World War I for assistance, Philippe Pétain, who was the hero of Verdun, and Maxime Weygand, who was the chief of staff of Victory Campaign in 1918. Weygand was 73, Pétain was even older, but their reputations bolstered the hopes of some within France. On May 16th, Reynaud and Gamelin met with Churchill. Gamelin admitted to Churchill that he had no troops available to stem the German onrush. Churchill then asked him, "Where's the strategic reserve?" Gamelin returned to Churchill, shook his head, and shrugged, "There is none." A long pause ensued. Churchill later would write, quote, "I was dumbfounded. It had never occurred to me that army commanders having to defend 500 miles of engaged front would have left themselves unprovided with a strategic reserve. What was the Maginot Line for?" Weygand would take the reins from Gamelin and had a plan to attack the Panzer Corridor. Coordinated convergent attacks from the north and south, but the French army was already in bad shape by then, and the armies to the south lacked transport, tanks, and artillery. Thus, even though his plan of attack was generally considered the correct appreciation of how to deal with blitzkrieg, it was also untenable at the time. French army leadership became disillusioned. Captain Beaufort of the French Army High Command wrote, quote, "I must confess that the morale of the French High Command was very quickly broken. In fact, the night when we happened to know that the front had been broken through at Sedan, at that time the feeling was that everything was lost. I saw General George, who was commanding the northeastern front. I saw him sobbing and saying there have been some deficiencies." Yeah, I'll say. Army Group A dashed toward the French coast, reaching the mouth of the River Somme on the English Channel by May 20th. The French and British forces were now trapped between A and B. The British would fall back to the French coast at Dunkirk, which gets to the evacuation of Dunkirk, which begins May 26, 1940. The Weygand Line failed because the French was outnumbered, lacked tanks, anti-tank weapons, and air cover. This would lead to the bombing of Paris beginning June 3rd, and the Germans, of course, would enter Paris a scant 11 days later on the 14th of June. But let's get back to Dunkirk. So these troops, these forces are trapped, but Hitler decides to halt his attack for 3 days. He has hundreds of thousands of troops surrounded. Why? This has been a major question for historians. Some argue it was to conserve armor for operations in the South. Maybe it had to do with Hitler's feelings about the British. Again, he believed the Anglo-Saxon race was dominant, was ideal, and the British were part of that Anglo-Saxon race. He believed if the British would just line up with him, everything would be fine, and he gave them that opportunity. Sympathy? Hardly. He could fear total humiliation, which would have hampered potential negotiations. The Luftwaffe? Direct Number 13 called for annihilation of the French, British, and Belgian forces, and for the Luftwaffe to prevent the escape of British soldiers across the Channel. But again, this 3-day delay really helped these troops. So what would happen? The French would fight while the British escaped. Churchill insisted that they go back for the French troops, of which some did survive. Over 338,000 men escaped. Almost 140,000 of these were French, Polish, or Belgian. 800 civilian vessels were used to ferry troops across the Channel. They used anything they could find: fishing boats, pleasure steamers, tugs. Initially, the British government thought it could maybe save 40,000 men. The fact that 338,000 escaped, this was quite an improvement over projection. Men escaped, but what about the goods? No, that didn't happen. Vehicles, field artillery, anti-tank guns, ammunition, fuel stocks, all this was left behind, and the Germans capitalized. Now, some see Operation Dynamo, which was the escape from Dunkirk, as a victory. Is this propaganda, or was it a turning point? Were they right to retreat? And is this where the relationship between the British and the French ended? Now, a few historical interpretations of Dunkirk. Keegan, who I think is the best, well, his work, World War II, or is it the Second World War? One of those two, very confusing, really provides, I think, the best beginning to end narrative of World War II and all the intricacies involved. He argued Hitler recognized that his armor would get bogged down in the lowlands, in the canals and rivers around Dunkirk, and thus he paused, again, allowing things to change and to allow the Luftwaffe to come in. Historian Ian Kershaw has studied a May 24th conference with Hitler and German commander von Rundstedt. His conclusion, quote, what Hitler was doing there on May 24th, that crucial day, was actually agreeing to the suggestion put forward by the commander of the German forces in the West, who wanted to preserve the tanks for what they saw as a greater need, which was to destroy the French troops by moving south against them. As Goering had promised Hitler that the British troops would be bombed to bits from the air anyway. But even though the Luftwaffe planes did bomb Dunkirk, they did not destroy the armies sheltering there, which led to the May 27th decision for the German army to then advance. John French, after World War I, the British retained an army and now understood changes in warfare. They were now well trained, which is what allowed them to lead this. French is very much in the minority in this argument. For Alistair Horn and Eugenia Kiesling, they argued the French failed to rebuild their military after World War I, which led to their failure in the Battle of France, and this ultimate, again, the fall of France itself. Hugh Sebag Montefiore, his work Dunkirk, Fight to the Last Man, tells the tale of those who stayed and fought, focuses on the bravery of these men, and that their will to fight showed the differences between the French and the British of the time. Which leads, of course, to British surrender. In early June, the French are foundering. Last-ditch efforts by the British are to no avail. Weygand tells Churchill and the French ministers, quote, I am helpless. I cannot intervene, for I have no reserves. But some in France wanted to keep fighting, Charles de Gaulle being one of them. Again, de Gaulle is one of the heroes of World War II. June 14th, he proposes to Churchill the formation of a union of Britain and France. Churchill offered such a declaration of union to Reynaud on June 16th, but he would be denied. Now, it's important to note de Gaulle at this point is not an official prime minister, not official leader in France. One official spoke that he, quote, did not want France to become a dominion of the British Empire. So they didn't want to unite with Britain because they didn't want to become a dominion of the British Empire. I guess it's better to be part of the German Empire. Pétain finds himself more concerned with the takeover by the left. Domestically, he would seek an armistice with Germany to prevent all-out disorder. President Lebrun desires formation of a government, sends de Gaulle to Britain to carry on the resistance. June 18th, de Gaulle broadcasts from London to the French people, quote, this war has not been settled by the Battle of France. This war is a world war. Whatever happens, the flame of resistance must not and will not be extinguished. He called on all Frenchmen who could join him on British soil to continue and fight. Very motivational, very inspirational. This is one of de Gaulle's the high points of his career. Pétain, his reaction, he court-martialed and condemned de Gaulle as a traitor. Again, he's more worried about domestic issues and the left and losing power. Pétain also broadcast to the French people. He would actually do this the day before de Gaulle's because he knew what de Gaulle was going to say. Quote, Frenchmen, at the appeal of the President of the Republic, I have today assumed the direction of the government of France. I give myself to France to assuage her misfortune. It is with a heavy heart that I say we must end the fight. Last night I applied to our adversary to ask if he prepared to seek with me, soldier to soldier, after the battle, honorably the means whereby hostilities may cease. The French were forced to sign the armistice in the same car the Germans signed theirs at the end of World War I. Again, this was about humiliation. Paris, northern France, and its borders with Belgium, Switzerland, and the Atlantic were to become a zone of German occupation. Italy was to occupy southeastern France. The French army was reduced to 100,000 men. The French Empire to remain under the control of the French government, as was the Navy, which was to be demilitarized. Captured Frenchmen to remain in German hands, roughly 2 million of them. This would be finalized June 25th. This constituted French humiliation on a number of levels, as they were not truly allowed to keep their own sovereignty or their own land. Reactions to this? One German engineer said, quote, the Great Battle of France is over. It lasted 26 years. King George VI, don't hide your feelings, Quote, I feel happier now that we have no allies to be polite to and to pamper. Churchill, quote, the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. And obviously he was right. The French were ill prepared for war. They had not developed their army or allowed it to evolve after World War I. Thus, they did not have the materials or the training to fight against the Prussian war machine. Adam Tooze, Tooze, adds that, quote, the uncanny elan of the German troops who displayed truly remarkable fighting capacity in that offensive, the extraordinary marching achievements by the infantry, continuous fighting over days and days and days, essentially without sleep. But he notes this was a victory keyed by, quote, the incapacity of the British and French military leaderships to respond with the necessary speed to the German offensive. So, you have, again, this fall of France. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating, and the Germans take advantage. And again, we talked about, or I had touched upon, Churchill had urged Pétain to form this union between France and Britain. He then recommended the government move to Algeria and conduct the war from there. Pétain refused. Churchill was concerned. The French had the fourth largest navy, and now it was potentially in Hitler's hands. And the armistice agreed it could only be used for reconnaissance, but why trust Hitler? In late June, he would send Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville to force the surrender of the remaining battleships and battle cruisers or destroy them. Some were taken by the British at Mers el Kabir base. The French commander told to join the British squadron and be demilitarized at the British port or scuttle ships where they were. Admiral Gensoul rejected this ultimatum of the British and ordered the ships to be readied. The British task force opened fire. Britain, of course, completes the damage, and the core of the French fleet is rendered useless. The French are not happy. Vice Premier Pierre Laval even recommended declaring war on the British, but they settled for indignation. Why do it? Again, Churchill feared that Hitler would use these ships with the German Navy, and the Germans did not need any more advantages at this point. Admiral Jean-Francois Darlan was commander of the force. He was strongly anti-British. He refused to order the ships to sail to Britain or to neutral ports before the armistice. Very much he opened the door for this. Now, I bring this up because here you have Churchill essentially destroying French ships. Not essentially, he did. He ordered this destruction. And, you know, one can look at maybe this is the end of the French and British arrangement. And you can see even from some of the reaction from these French leaders, there's already some resentment toward the British. But Churchill, this was a controversial move to say the least, but he did this knowing that Hitler would probably take advantage of these. No matter what the armistice said, Hitler would use this to his advantage. So even though this was controversial, many would criticize him then and even later, Churchill probably made the right move. But again, this kind of brings everything to an end. And one can ask, why are we so critical of the French? Is it their attitude of defeatism, the arrogance of their leadership? Obviously, they were rolled over in the fall of France, in the Battle of France, and just call it the fall of France. It happened so quickly, and of course, jokes have taken on their own existence since then. And as I mentioned earlier, what do we make of the Swedes and the Swiss? They rolled over for Hitler as well. They would assist during the war, and not necessarily just because of force. But so here we have, again, much of the West falls to Hitler, and it is at this point, knowing that Hitler is already aligned with Italy and with Japan. He has a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. The only country standing is Britain, and Britain is led by Churchill, and Churchill is the one man who will stand up to Hitler and the Nazis and make a difference.